Greetings, viewers! I'm Victor Crimson, and welcome to Tormented Tales, where we share stories that are both truly terrifying and terrifyingly true. Before we dive into tonight's duet of diabolical delicacies from the deep forest, however, a quick reminder to hit that subscribe button to ensure that you do not miss out on any of our future collections. And as always, if you want to submit your own true tale of terror for us to read out, send them along to the address in the description below. Tonight's true accounts come from a very dark place, but one that may well be familiar to you. After all, there's nothing more pleasant than a stroll in the forest by daylight, when the birds are singing and the trees are swaying in the breeze, and the sunlight dapples the path with its golden light. Or at least, that's what the normal folk tell me. But what of those parts of the forest where the sunlight rarely touches? Those deeper, darker places where birds are not the only things to flutter and scurry between the branches. These are tales of the deep forest, places that I would recommend you try your best to avoid. Our first story comes from Alan in Maryland and concerns a strip of land that is in itself deeply concerning. Acres Stretch. I think the deep forest has always scared me because it was always off limits. We'd go camping on the outskirts, sure. We'd even hike in the surrounding hills, but the deepest part of the forest, the part that we called Acres Stretch, was different. That land belonged to Mr. Ager. I've often wondered if the name was a mishearing of his name, Ager, but nobody was around to confirm or deny that. People, I've found, do not like to talk about that place. It wasn't fenced off. There were no high barricades with signs saying that the wires were electrified, no ancient dry stone walls to protect the border, put up by people long forgotten. There wasn't any barbed wire or even a rotten pine board fence. All there was to keep you from straying into Acres Stretch was a small wooden sign. The sign and the stories. Still, that was enough. You could walk for hours through the rest of the forest without a care, clambering over fallen logs, treading carefully over moss-covered paths, and stretching over stepping stones laid across the creek. But once you reached that boundary line, you knew that something had changed. There, the path narrowed. The trees hung tall on either side, leaning slightly inward, so that they formed a shape, almost like an archway over the small dirt trail. A huge, stately oak stood to one side of the boundary, and that was where the sign was nailed. This is Acres Stretch, deep forest. Keep out. It was hardly terrifying. Businesslike, straight to the point. It wasn't some ancient curse as some of my more imaginative classmates claimed, and it didn't contain the threats that children whispered to each other at sleepovers and on Halloween. The sign says, "All ye that enter here must give up their souls," one kid told me once, though of course, having not seen the sign for myself, I knew to disregard that as nonsense. What was not so easy to put aside were the other stories. They came from historians, folklorists, and reporters. None of them were proven, but they all sounded convincing. The story, or at least the one that I was told, was that the middle of Acres Stretch contains a clearing, at the center of which there stands a huge, ancient statue. The statue, so the historians say, is almost identical to the one known as Urfa Man, a humanoid statue found in southern Turkey. It stands around 2 meters tall and is made of light sandstone. It has no mouth, but the eyes, sunken back into deep-set sockets, have large pieces of jet black obsidian fixed inside, so that the thing stares back at you with a glare like pools of oil. Imagine a snowman with coal-lump eyes, but made of solid rock, and you have a good idea what I'm talking about. I've seen photos of that Turkish statue online. It's apparently the oldest statue of a human being in the world, and is said to be around 11,000 years old. How old the statue in Acres Stretch is anyone's guess, if it's really there at all. What makes me think it is there, and what makes me convinced that I will never in my life dare to set foot in that part of the deep forest, is what I saw on that border to that place, one winter's night around 15 years ago. I'd headed through the forest on a hike, and coming to the edge of Acres Stretch, had decided it was time to turn around and head back. As I approached the part where the sign always hung, I saw a man standing just at the boundary. He was holding an infant of maybe 7 or 8 months old to his chest and was crying hysterically. I sank back into the bushes so as not to be seen, all too aware that the sun was sinking below the hills. I watched as the man shook his head, as if arguing with himself or trying his best to refuse something. Then, as I watched in silence, he stepped over the boundary, into the deep forest, and into Acres Stretch. Rising to my feet, I turned to begin walking back, but just as I did, I heard a screech, a high-pitched wail like nothing I've ever heard before or since. It was the sound, I thought, of the baby crying, but not for milk or comfort. It was a call that I'm sure every child is capable of making, but should ever be forced to make. For a moment, I thought about investigating, entering the forest despite my fears, but before I could even approach, the man I had seen earlier came bolting out through the undergrowth, screaming and wailing. He ran at full pace, out from Acres Stretch, out along the path with tears streaming down his face. He was no longer carrying the baby. This incident occurred in 1998. Before I owned a mobile phone, and before any phone I had would have had coverage at that point, I stared into the woods. Perhaps, I thought, the man had met someone there. Perhaps he had arranged to pass the baby on to its mother who was waiting in the forest. Maybe there's a house or a home somewhere deep in that forest, and the baby was somewhere safe and warm. Maybe, I thought, but deep down, I knew better. I didn't go into the forest. Instead, I trudged back to town, trying to convince myself that the man wouldn't have just left the child there, that he wouldn't have just given the infant over as an offering to the forest or as some awful sacrifice to the strange and ancient god depicted in the statue. That idea, I told myself, was stupid, ridiculous, the kind of thing you read in a horror story, but I suspected it might also be the truth. The following day, I went to the police. I told them what I'd seen and made an official statement. That was the last I heard. There was no follow-up, but there were rumors. Stories over the next 15 years of children who had vanished, of strange lights seen deep in that forest, and of weird, ancient rites that people out there practiced. I've never been back, or even close to the border. As far as I'm concerned, when the sign said, "Keep out," that was good advice. What do you think, viewers? Is Alan right to stay away? What do you think became of the child taken into the forest, and what exactly would a statue of that kind be doing there in the first place? Have any of you seen this so-called Urfa Man statue? If you have any ideas or suggestions, let us know in the comments below. Our second story was submitted by Professor D. Clark, who currently resides in Dallas. The story itself, however, concerns a stretch of land far from that part of the world, an unexplored place that the curious can read about online, but which I would probably recommend you never attempt to visit. Unmapped terrain. I can honestly say that in my time there, I heard a lot of strange things. Rumors and stories about things in the forest, not just folk tales and hearsay, but actual first-hand accounts from other scientists and researchers, people I know and respect, and who are not taken to flights of fancy. The sorts of people who, when they tell you they've seen something, you tend to believe them. That is what made Donlan's story so terrifying. Not only the fact that it was creepy, but the fact I believed 100% that it was true. Over the course of 3 years, from 2016 to 2019, I worked as a field research assistant on a botanical exploration expedition in the Amazon rainforest. The stated aim of the project was to investigate and recover samples of plant life that could, potentially, have beneficial medicinal properties, but because of the unique location of the work, our remit was actually much wider. If you look up unexplored areas or unexplored forests on Google, you'll likely get a list that includes parts of Kamchatka in Russia, the Star Mountains in New Guinea, and somewhere on that list, the portion of the deep forest known as Vale do Javari in Brazil, close to the border with Peru. That's where we spent our time. While some portions of this forest are thought to be home to uncontacted tribes, huge swathes of the area have never been properly surveyed or even explored. Even getting permits to visit the place is a nightmare, never mind actually getting there physically. But in 2016, that's exactly what me and a team of 12 other botanists, zoologists, and ethnobiologists did. We stayed in the area for almost 3 years, and whilst our remit was to look at plant life, we were given the green light by various governmental organizations in numerous countries to see what we could find, whether that be plant and insect life, or animals, and even people. To put it bluntly, even the world's foremost experts had no idea what might be in there. They still don't. From experience of actually being there, and by there I mean exploring a very small portion of the deep forest, I can tell you a few things. For one, the light is different. It's hard to explain, but the deep forest in Vale do Javari just looks darker. The patch of forest you came out from is dense and shaded. Though it's obviously humid at times, it can be pleasantly cool on summer days, but that part, leading to the deeper forest, is darker still. It seems at first glance to have a completely different coloring to it, as if the shadows are somehow deeper, the spaces between the trees longer, and somehow more black. I'll admit that considering the effect of that darkness during the daytime, the idea of going into the forest at night made my skin crawl. Yet for Donlan, that was exactly what was required. Each evening, he, 2 forest trackers, and several other scientists would set off in a group into an unexplored patch of forest. Unlike me, who was there for the plants, Donlan's main interest was insects, and using electric lights and a huge catchment net, he collected and indeed discovered an enormous variety of species by attracting them toward it. Where the story got disturbing was with the other things he attracted. According to Donlan, he had just finished setting up one of the standing floodlights, and with the help of a colleague was busy draping the net over a metal frame, when he heard a sound coming from somewhere around 10 feet in front of him. Now you have to remember that unlike most parts of the forest that come alive at night, with a cacophony of sound, this portion of the forest was unusually quiet. What Donlan heard, he said, was his mother. She was calling to me, he said, from just beyond the point where the light extended, as if she'd chosen to stand in the dark, just beyond the edge of the light. She was speaking sweetly, "Donnie, Donnie," like she used to when I was a kid. Now, obviously, I knew it wasn't my mother calling, not only because she couldn't be here in the middle of the rainforest at night, but also because she had died a few years earlier. Still, that was her voice. I even recorded it. It made me wonder, he said, how many men and animals had stepped out of the light into that dark, thinking that they could hear the sound of their mothers calling them, and what happens to them if they stray from the path and choose to follow the sound. We know that Venus flytraps will use sweet nectar or color to attract their prey. Could it be that something back there, plant or animal, has developed this as a strategy, imitating the mother's call to lead its prey away, a way of tempting its food to stray closer? When I asked Donlan how anything in the forest could know what his mother sounded like, he said that he had played clips of her, recorded on his phone, whilst laying in his hammock, reminiscing, and to some extent, grieving her loss. Whatever was back there, he said, heard that voice and imitated it perfectly. For me, that was enough. My mind ran away with images of plants, vines with enormous thorns wrapping around a child like a huge anaconda, the spines piercing and tearing the flesh, or something close to a Venus flytrap, but the size of a child's paddling pool, snapping shut like a bear trap around the feet of a passerby. Donlan imagined an animal, a thing, he said, between a man and a dog, with a long, dark snout and razor-sharp teeth that could call and mimic the sounds it had heard, leading travelers in the forest astray and tempting them ever closer. I returned home a month later. 3 weeks ago, I was asked whether I would be interested in returning to the forest as part of a larger expedition. I not only turned down the offer, but I told the other scientists my reasons. I have given them my warning. I only hope they listen to me and not to the thing in the forest. That sounds like good advice to me. That's all for this edition, kiddies. Be sure to subscribe and tune in next time for more examples of truth being both stranger and more terrifying than fiction. Until then, sweet dreams.